So thanks everybody for joining. I see we've got about a little over 60 participants, which is amazing. And so we're going to go ahead and get started. And Emily has had the opportunity to have a video recording made that shows a grain bin entrapment. And so we want to share and showcase that video first to hopefully start getting you as participants to think about grain bin handling and safety. And after the video, we will dive in and introduce our two panelists that are going to be talking about grain bin handling and safety. So Emily, take it away.
Yes, and now we did test the video before we started. You should be able to see it okay. I know the other panelists had said it was just slightly quiet, so you may need to turn up the volume on your end in order to hear it. And I also ask for your grace. I filmed this morning in my kitchen since I don't have access to all my usual space right now with COVID. So yes. Here's this. And so really what it is it's going to be just kind of a quick demonstration about why we talk about farm safety. One second, I'm just getting the sound here. There we go. When talking about grain bin safety and grain transportation safety, the major hazard that we're worried about is entrapment. Entrapment is often the cause of many fatalities across the Midwest and the country. And so I just want to really briefly demonstrate why this is such a big hazard for us. So we know flowing grain moves very, very quickly. And the three major ways that people are often entrapped in grain bins is by flowing grain, or if they're in a gravity box, such as this, as grain is being flowed out through the bottom. Also avalanche. So if grain is not stored at the right condition, it can crust along the walls of the bin. And then as you try to knock that wall down, it can cause an avalanche and bury you. Lastly, and another really, really common issue that we see is bridged grain. Again, this is grain that has not been stored at the right condition or has gotten too much moisture and has molded and formed a crust across the top. So when you're looking from the top of the bin down into it, it looks like it's solid and that you will be able to walk on top of it. And then people walk on it, the crust breaks, and then they fall down into the gully that is below it, and again can be entrapped in grain. Now, as we'll learn and talk more about today, we are really, really adamant about people not entering the bin. And we're going to demonstrate why it's so dangerous. Again, grain moves very, very quickly. And once you are submerged in grain, even just up to your waist, it can take over 600 pounds of force plus to pull somebody out. So we are going to demonstrate that today. You can see I have my little gravity box wagon here with the clear sides. And this is our farmer, Shirley. Now, Shirley doesn't always do the right thing, and Shirley, she will end up in trouble because of it. So we will move this to the edge here. And again, for most people, it will take 10 seconds tops for them to become completely submerged in flowing grain. So we'll see how long it's going to take Shirley here. So I know this is something I did a lot as a child, much to my parents' chagrin, I have no doubt, is playing in the gravity box. And it's especially dangerous if somebody is in or around the gravity box as it's being emptied. So as you can see, in a matter of seconds, Shirley got buried all the way up here to her shoulders. And she's also kind of caught in the door here. So this, again, could be a cause of major injury or even fatality for many people on the farm, which is why we really encourage people to practice grain bin safety and to be mindful when they're around anything with grain in it, gravity boxes, grain carts, etc., to avoid an incident such as this.
Awesome, Emily. Thanks for getting us started this morning with that great visual and food for thought. And so now that everybody's kind of got that set in their mind and can start thinking about the implications of what can happen when working and handling with grain, I am proud and excited to announce our two panelists that are joining us this morning. And so I'm going to introduce Rich Shook and Ken Hellevang. And Rich, would you mind briefly introducing yourself to our group this morning?
Sure. First of all, I guess I'm honored to be asked to sit in on this discussion. It's something that our department and our rescue technicians here in this area have been striving to try and prevent these kind of accidents to happen on the farm. I've got 17 years in the fire service and 10 years as a rescue technician, specializing, well, as specialized as you can get, into grain engulfment and rescues. So that's about what my background consists of, is how long I've been doing it.
And Rich, you're based out of Kindred, North Dakota, correct?
Correct.
Awesome. Well, thanks for joining us. And our second panelist is the famous Ken Hellevang, our NDSU Extension Engineer Specialist. And Ken, would you please share a brief introduction of yourself?
Well, like NJ says, my focus has been as an extension specialist, primarily working in the grain drying and storage area. Grain safety has been part of my program, I guess, since day one. And I'm getting to be a long timer. I started in August of 1980 and had been working with grain safety pretty much right from the beginning. And so have kind of worked a variety of different angles related to grain safety and grain storage.
Awesome. So I think we're going to go ahead and get started. If you do have questions for the panelists or Emily and I, please use the Q&A or the chat features. Emily is going to be monitoring that. And Emily, why don't you go ahead and get started with our panel?
Yes, all right. So we did our demonstration here. And so you can see that in that demonstration, I was talking, specifically about grain handling, whether that's transport, getting it in and out of the bin, etc. So first, I just want to ask Ken, as an engineer, how have you seen grain storage and handling change, in the last 10, 15, 20 years? How does that look? What have you noticed, especially from a safety standpoint?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is just the size of the equipment and the facilities. When I started, we very typically would have 3,000 bushel capacity bins. Today, 50, 60,000 bushels are pretty routine. And so the size of the facility has increased. But probably more important is the size of the conveying equipment. So where we used to be moving just a couple hundred bushels an hour, now we're moving thousands of bushels an hour. And so the grain that's flowing within the structure is flowing much more rapidly than what it used to. We used to talk about being able to go in a bin and walk your way out of a flowing grain accident. That isn't going to happen today. That grain is flowing so rapidly that we routinely talk about it being quicksand, that you're just become entrapped. And surprisingly, just up to your knees gets you to the point where the ability for you to walk and move around in there is greatly limited. And so that's a huge change from a grain entrapment standpoint. I think there's other issues that we typically still talk about. Sweep augers on the bottom continue to be an issue. Probably one that I talk more about than what I used to is just the respiratory hazard, the grain dust, the grain molds, those type of things that we really didn't talk about much even 15, 20 years ago.
Great. Thanks so much, Ken. And I think that, respiratory protection especially has kind of come into the limelight during COVID. I know that a lot of places are short on N95 and other sort of respirators that they need for these grain bins. And so that just adds, more challenges to what we're trying to do to keep people safe.
Yeah, so that really leads great into our next discussion point for Rich. And so I've gotten the privilege to work with you on quite a few projects, and our goal is to continue and move forward with our farm safety initiative when it comes to grain handling. And if you're comfortable, I'd like to ask you to share your story of how grain storage and handling has impacted your life and brought you where you are today.
Sure. As difficult as it is to discuss, in 2008, I lost a fellow firefighter that we celebrated Christmas just a few days prior to his accident. December 26th, 2008, I believe was when the accident occurred on his family farm. And being the first officer on scene, obviously from a farm, we know how to basically maneuver around these bins, but the dynamics changed. He had elevated hopper bins 30 feet above the ground and used them. So he fed a wet bin into a dryer and then up into these hopper bins. And then you could load both hoppers in the truck and basically move the grain fairly efficiently around the farm. And what happened was the dryer ran out of grain and it didn't kick the fans on. So the grain froze inside the bin. As far as we're willing to dissect and look into it. Upon the problem of not getting the grain out of the bin, he entered into the bin and proceeded to climb down the ladder and basically was consumed by the avalanche scenario, to where he slipped and then fell into the bin, and then the grain collapsed and buried him under 350 to 400 bushels. He went missing probably right around 9 o'clock in the morning to 10 o'clock was the last contact he had with anyone. We received the page at about 6:30, 7 o'clock p.m. By, I think it was 11 o'clock, we were removing him from the bin. It hit our department really hard. He's one of the guys who talked me into joining the fire department. And once that became a thing, we had a member that was also on Fargo Fire, and he got a core group of us together to start this specialized rescue to try and mitigate these disasters. And since then, we've basically worked and dissected from almost every angle to try and see if we can facilitate and mitigate and practice safe entry procedures and try and build some techniques on how to perform rescues. And I've been privileged enough to be called an expert, which I kind of deny, but these incidents are becoming more and more frequently. And I think this is just an awesome topic to hit because it's everywhere. You know, farming is everywhere. And Purdue University has been tracking these for a heck of a long time. And it seems like the incidents are becoming frequent and everyone sees the perfect storm. And And I've jumped on board with Extension, and we've gotten such a great relationship with them. And it's something that I think is a great program to push out to everybody.
Well, thank you, Rich. That story is so powerful, and I applaud you and appreciate you for sharing that, because we know how difficult that is to experience, and for you to be able to share that today with our guests, to really have that deep understanding. It kind of tied what Emily's video shared and what Ken had said about how grain handling has changed. You know, you talked about your buddy's farm, how it had those huge hopper bins, the dryer systems that we're utilizing in today. It's all, you know, can be controlled by the push button of your cell phone. And so these are just some things that once we get them all into consideration and they're all happening at the same time, you know, that's when these accidents can happen. So we appreciate you sharing that story.
Yeah, and I just want to second that, Rich. You know, it's good in a certain way to hear about how these types of accidents impact people. And, you know, in your case too, it impacted more than just him and his family. You know, it impacted this larger group that he was a part of. And it's unfortunate, but it's good that this is something that you have taken some initiative to work on and work towards. And I think that that's really important. You know, it's vital that we have these local groups that are able to help in these types of situations, that can help with extractions, can help with rescues. That's really, really key. But another key, at least for me, I know I talk a lot about, you know, prevention is how do we get to a point where people aren't going into the bins? And so this question again for Ken, you know, how can producers be looking at grain condition, you know, as a preventative measure for these grain bin issues, you know, and what, you know, would you recommend producers do in order to prevent, you know, issues with crusting and bridging and, you know, poor grain condition in the bin that would cause people to need to go into it?
Well, it's easy to say that it's just doing what we've been taught to do over the years. Grain stores best when it's dry and when it's cool. And so if we provide that environment, we really don't anticipate any kind of bridging occurring. Unfortunately, Mother Nature doesn't always cooperate with us. And 2019 is a perfect example of that. We had late corn. People were worried about the winter season approaching. And so we had a lot of corn that was harvested, placed into storage at moisture contents way above what it should have been. And that then can lead to problems. But even then, kind of the rule of thumb that we go by is we can harvest corn at 18 to 20% moisture, put it into a bin, and as long as we keep it cool, we can bring that corn back out and it will be able to be dried. Once we start getting above that, once we get to 23, 24% moisture, that corn doesn't flow anymore. And right away we start having problems. So it becomes a management decision all along that, yeah, if we've got some 21% moisture corn, we may be able to put it into the bin, but that means that we need to take it out and dry it fairly quickly before it develops problems. And, you know, what you described, the crusting, the bridging on the sidewall, chunks that end up in the grain mass, they're all there because we're storing grain too wet and too warm. And so it really comes down to understanding grain storage management and making sure that we're doing our part to keep that grain in good condition.
Great, thanks, Ken. You know, I jotted down two keywords here that I think you said, one of them being management. You know, most of my experience is on the livestock side versus the crop side, but that's something that we talk about there too, is, you know, the way that you are managing your operation and your product, whether it's grain, whether it's livestock, plays a really key role in how you do that. And with that, the other word I wrote down that you said was awareness. So if you are going to put grain in the bin and it is a little more wet than you would like it to be, being really aware of that, and then figuring out then how do we make sure that that grain gets, you know, handled first, or what else can we do with it to make sure that we aren't going to see these issues down the road. And so I think that that is a really great point that you made, Ken, in the management of it and the awareness piece as well.
And I'm going to interrupt for just another comment that on a slide that I typically use, I've chosen to put a definition for manage on that slide. Manage means to take action with skill. And I think too many times people either aren't monitoring the grain going in, they're not sure what the moisture content is, or they don't have that fundamental skill level to actually manage the grain to prevent those problems. Too many times I think we put it in at 20-21% moisture and just think, yeah, it's going to store until I take it out. And it takes more than that.
Yeah, great point, Ken. Thanks.
Yeah, and that really, just hearing that, you know, you think about what are some of the reasons behind maybe not necessarily not being able to develop and master that skill, but we have to think about what's going on at that time of harvest. So we have lots of semis, you know, that's what we're dealing with now, is semis versus single axle trucks bringing in all of this grain and product. And so like you said, Ken and Emily, you know, is each truckload different? Is it, you know, in terms of moisture, and how are we managing all those loads that we have drivers taking care of and other farm hands? And so there's just a lot in play. And the reason why I bring that up is this is why we're here. It happens. Our best management efforts have tried true, but in the same token, there are incidences where those hot pockets and hot spots develop, and that's where we start seeing issues. So for Rich, my question to you is, it's kind of a scenario. So if a farmer is unloading a bin full of corn and pretty soon he or she notices that the corn's just not flowing out anymore, it's not even just trickling, it's stopped. What are the first things that person should do when faced in that type of scenario?
Well, I guess the first thing that I would do, obviously, if things are going smooth and you're removing the commodity from the bin, say it stopped, I guess I would shut down all equipment, lockout, tag out.
What does that mean, Rich? What does lockout, tag out mean?
So lockout, tag out is basically a system where you on the farm, you know, you could have, I guess what I implemented on the farmer that I help out is we took livestock tags. So we took livestock tags and small carabiner clips, and what we would do is go to the main panel, and on each one of these tags, it has your name. So what I would do is I would take my tag that says Rich, I would go over to the electrical panel, I'd throw the breaker, and then clip it shut. Then I would proceed to go to the shed, grab my PPE, which would be my fall protection, my harness, and then a small section of rope. I'd get on the radio and I'd make sure I would call for an attendant. So at that point in the time, another person would roll into the yard with a pickup, and I'd be like, okay, I got no grain coming out of this bin. So obviously I need to investigate it. So then I'd climb the structure, kind of look in there. Obviously, any of us that have ever looked into a grain bin are like, crap. I see a little cone in the center and I see a chunk in there. So what's my first thought is, well, I can just walk right down there and knock that baby out and we can be finishing out the day. So then I'm like, okay, better start thinking this through. Tell my attendant what I see. On the rescue side, we would monitor air quality. Obviously, farmers aren't going to have air quality monitoring equipment, but if you turn on a fan and you were to, if you don't have any moldy grain and things like that, and you're not treating it with any toxic chemicals, the space should be safe. But that's the other realm of this that you enter into is it's a confined space. It has limited means of entry and exit, and it's not made for continuous occupancy. And plus it contains known hazards, whether it's sloped floor, bridged grain, gases, moving equipment, things like that. So you're going to cross that threshold and enter into that situation, tie off, have your attendant watching from the opening if you're going to go in. Obviously, we would recommend a zero entry, whether it's you take a long piece of PVC pipe or something to poke at what you have in there and then try and fire things up and make sure you could keep grain moving. The other thing would be is the chunk frozen or is it rotten grain, or there's a lot of things you have to evaluate. Could I turn on the fans and move to another bin and then come back and check this one in a few days? There's a lot of things that you need to take into consideration before you cross that threshold with gambling with your life, looking into the bins.
That's great feedback, because really that's exactly what someone's going through when this scenario would happen, right? So it's something's plugged, grain's not moving. Those decisions are made instantaneously. And so I think it was important for us to ask you that question, because really we want producers to start thinking about what are the ramifications here and what choices do I have, instead of just, okay, it's clogged, I need to go in and get it unclogged. We really have to start opening up our options and look at what behavior choices we have in order to make that grain move. And I can't echo that enough. And Emily and Ken, we would really stress to not go in the bin, but obviously if you got to get that grain moved out, then having that opportunity, like Ken said, to talk about the harness procedure and the personal protective equipment that ensures with grain bin handling. So I think those are some really good comments.
Yeah, I agree with you, Angie, on that. Oh, were you going to say something?
I was just going to jump in. I was just glancing over at the chat and somebody was asking about OSHA rules. Typically, they're not enforced on farms, at least most of the family farms. And the other thing that really plays in here is that the person frequently who's doing the labor and the person who is trying to keep the operation moving, the manager, and the owner who has financial concerns are the same person. And that then interferes with some of your decision-making process. Maybe they're guys that are close to my age and maybe did it once or twice before, and all of a sudden you're not thinking clearly. And so what Angie was talking about, stopping, taking some time to think it through, do some planning, really becomes important.
Yeah, thanks for adding that, Ken. And I totally agree with that. Something that I say a lot in my work is, you know, for farm safety, it comes down to slow down, think twice, be safe. And like you said, Ken, you know, these people that have maybe been doing it a long time and it's just routine. And I always tell everybody, all it takes is one time. It doesn't matter to me. It doesn't matter to the equipment. It doesn't matter to livestock how many times you've done it. That's not any sort of qualifier that you're more safe because you've done it more. But something that I wanted to ask you about, Ken, is, you know, can you talk just briefly, you know, you're our engineer here, you know, about the considerations with structure and design of grain bins, right? And you mentioned early on, grain bins have gotten a lot bigger over time. And so with that, you know, we need to think about how that impacts these structures' ability to hold all this grain, but then also when we're thinking about somebody in a safety harness and that weight, you know, what do we need to be aware of as far as design goes and that kind of thing?
Well, there are a number of things that we need to take into consideration, and we'll talk first about maybe the bin roof. That the bin roof is designed to handle a certain amount of load, and it may handle the additional weight of a safety harness as long as it's attached in the right location and attached correctly. But the bin manufacturers have specific locations in mind for adding those kinds of loads. And so make sure that before you just drill a hole in the roof and hook something in there, that is being taken into consideration. The other point, though, that I wanted to make is that bins are really intended to be loaded uniformly around the whole perimeter of the bin. And surprisingly, if we start unloading from just one side of the bin, that deformation will actually turn that grain bin into first an egg shape kind of shape to it, which then in some cases can actually cause bin seams to fail or the steel to collapse. And so a person has to be very careful when you start looking at puncturing holes or working around a grain bin, particularly in a rescue kind of situation. We recommend that we uniformly make openings around the perimeter of the bin to unload that bin rapidly if we do have a grain entrapment or engulfment. We don't want to just punch a hole on one side and let all the grain flow out there. It's going to be not only flowing past the individual that's in the bin and causing stresses there, but there really is a concern about the structural integrity of that grain bin. And so make sure that we're opening bin holes all the way around the perimeter in order to allow that grain to flow out. The other thing that comes to mind is that you start punching these holes in, it's not typically enough just to have a hole in the bin, depending on how full it is. We need to have a way of getting that grain moved away from the bin. Otherwise, we're not able to unload it to the level that's needed. So yes, structural integrity of that bin is important.
Yeah, and I'm just curious, Rich, do you have anything to add to that? You know, as somebody who is, you know, working in these types of rescue situations with, you know, being mindful of bin structure and that kind of thing.
Yeah, the main thing we try and preach, you know, when we do train with other fire departments and stuff that are unfamiliar with it is, you know, if you're going to cut a hole, make sure you cut uniform across from each other. And, you know, like Ken said, make sure anytime there's going to be a grain engulfment, the resources needed to try and get the grain away, you're going to need more trucks, conveyors, augers, payloaders, what have you. But on the structural side, we tell them not to ever cross any of the bolted seams or anything that would basically provide that bin with structural support. Because once you cut across those bolt lines, a lot of that is what's holding that bin together. And then what you're gonna have is a situation where you're gonna have a blowout. And then the structure would basically bury your rescuers and create just chaos on the scene. And now you've got multiple avenues of injury and potentially more engulfed victims buried in the grain.
Yeah, that's a great point, Rich. So I am going to say, I'm looking at the time here. We are going to have about 5 to 10 more minutes here of conversation before we start wrapping up. So now would be the time. If you do have any burning questions, you can put them in the chat or the Q&A. I know we've gotten a few already that we've been able to take care of, but consider this your final warning. And as you do all of that, I actually have a question. Something that I come across a lot, and you know, Rich, this is more a question for you, but Ken, I would really value your input on it as well. So I think we're all aware of a lot of grain bin accidents, and more specifically fatalities that have occurred that include multiple people. So traditionally, I shouldn't say traditionally, but sometimes an example I think of from Minnesota, we had a boy, a child that was around a harvest store actually and became overwhelmed by gases, and dad was there trying to help him, and then an uncle came and tried to assist as well, and they unfortunately all lost their lives. And that was right around Christmas time as well. So I'm just curious, you know, Rich, I want people to hear it from you. What do you do when you know or you suspect that somebody is trapped in a bin or a silo or anything, any confined space like that? What do you do, and maybe what don't you do?
Well, human nature is where you take into account the would-be rescuer becomes victim number 2, which leads to victim number 3. The first thing I would say to anybody is the call to 911 immediately to try and get emergency services en route to you. If you could potentially see the person and you don't know why they're down, obviously you're going to look at either a medical incident, or it could be just a health issue, or it would be potentially, silage gas, which is very similar to hydrogen sulfide or carbon monoxide poisoning. So airway is definitely going to be an important thing, but upon entry into that, now the first thing it does is it numbs your senses. So then you can't tell you're getting overtaken by it. And then now you go down, get sleepy and whatnot, and then you collapse. And now you've got 3 people, and the longer you're in there, survivability is obviously going to be critical, but emergency services should be the first call made. And I know it's easy for me to say, don't go in there, but when it's a family member of yours, it's definitely problematic. I know at my friend's incident in his bin, I was company officer. So I was on scene with first truck, and to know my best friend was sitting in there, I pretty much had to almost chain myself to the front bumper of that truck and allow 2 other rescuers to go in and begin the rescue until I turned over command to another officer when he arrived. And I guarantee that there was nothing that was going to keep me out of that bin.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point, Rich. And I know that can be so hard that we want to help the people that we care about most. But I think that that's a great message that you shared there, Rich. We're getting quite a few questions coming in here, so we're going to try to kind of rapid fire through these.
There's a ton of questions.
Yes. In the Q&A box, I had a question. What about grain bag safety? Is this something that we should train for when unloading bags? So Ken or Rich, any
Well, I'll
comment
just
on
say absolutely. We had one person that got themselves basically shrink wrapped into a grain bag, and fortunately they were able to access their knife and get themselves out. But yes, there's lots of the same kinds of issues that we need to keep in mind.
Yeah, there was an incident out in Jamestown too, to where I guess us in the rescue industry call them giant Hershey's Kisses. So a lot of times when the guys go to clear them up, it's just plastic, so they just cut it. And this person walked up the side of it and he cut it and it blew out and buried him. And one of the hired men happened to see it, is the story I got, of course. And they were able to run up there and get him uncovered. But those things will cause an engulfment just the same way as anything collapsing inside of a bin. And we've even had avalanches to where people have been buried on the outside of the bin because it collapses and comes out the door.
Yeah, that's a great question, and thanks for asking about grain bag storage. And another kind of a follow-up to you, Rich, would you want to explain that lockout tagout system? You know, kind of explain to our attendees what does that mean? And somebody had mentioned actually using a physical padlock with a key. So would you want to go into detail a little bit more about that?
So if you're going to go into a lockout tagout system on your family farm, there's many different angles you could use. For us in the fire service, when we come up to your farm, say you called us on your worst day, obviously lockout tagout is going to be anyone that's going to enter into that facility. Now that's enter into the facility. We would have a tag with a padlock on it with our name, and you would lock out that panel. That way no one can come up there and undo that lock unless they've cleared you because you're in that structure. Necessarily all it would be is if you took your tag and put it on that lockout tagout, until you go actually physically take it back off, that should never be energized. So I mean, these are just simple things that you could do, because if I have to struggle to get into an electrical panel, common sense would tell me that I need to investigate, why is this panel locked out? And if someone has their name on a tag that's hanging on it, I should maybe consult with them and see, so is there a reason why this is locked out and tagged out? And it goes back to an accountability system of Bill's tag is on this, and he was supposed to be loading this truck. Has anyone checked in with Bill? Okay, now all of a sudden we need to retrace our steps and see what led up to where we're at now. Not just pull it off and set it on top of the panel and fire it back up because Bill might be in that bin.
And I guess it's not exactly what we're talking about, but one of the things that we're seeing more today is all of the automation. The dryer kicks the augers on that moves grain and et cetera, et cetera. And so we need to make sure that all of that system gets shut down. And if we just happen to forget one piece, it might call for an auger to start, and we don't want that auger to be starting. So really make sure that somebody who understands the system has shut the system down.
All right, and looking here in the chat, we also have some questions. So I'm going out of order here, but I just have the information for it. So there was a question about fatalities in a given year. how many survive, that kind of information. And so Purdue University does an excellent job of releasing every year confined spaces, accidents and fatalities report. So I have the 2019 report here. The reports usually come out in March, so we're still waiting on the 2020 report. But in 2019, specifically for grain entrapments, and this is in our region, kind of Midwest, North Central, there were 38 grain entrapments and 23 of them were fatal. And then they also include, things related to falls and entanglements and that, which could also apply to, and asphyxiation as well, which could apply to a grain bin situation. But yeah, so we're seeing many accidents. And I know in 2019, Minnesota actually led the nation in the most grain bin fatalities, which was really unfortunate. And so in this question too, I know there was talk about outreach that we do, so things like this, education, demonstrations. I know in Minnesota, we do demonstrations at Farm Fest when that is held, those types of situations where we can really get out and show people what needs to be done. And I think the type of outreach that's being done in North Dakota with Extension and with what Rich and his team is doing as well is really important, is this training, not just for producers, but for others as well. And I know we had some questions about videos, and it looks like somebody else in the chat kind of answered on that. And please know that in Minnesota and North Dakota, we are working on getting some more videos and information out, including these webinars. So, please stay tuned. We know that this is a really important issue and our universities recognize that as well. And we're doing everything that we can. Looking through the chat here, let's see.
I'm going to interrupt for just a moment.
Yeah.
As far as videos, if you do a search on YouTube, there's some pretty good videos out there. In particular, the National Corn Growers Association did a shorter version and a longer version, trying to really focus not so much on the rescue procedure, but the dangers and the ramifications of grain entrapment. And so I'd encourage people, until we have things developed locally, to look at some of those resources. Yeah,
thanks, Ken. Yeah, absolutely. So there are resources available from other groups as well. Be sure to check those out. The National Farm Medicine Center, located in Wisconsin with the Marshfield Clinic, they have all sorts of stuff. But we're running short on time here. There are two more quick questions that I want to get to. Both kind of seem like they're for Ken. One of them, a 4,000 bushel hopper bottom bin. What are the guidelines for that? Or, what types of fall protection should people be mindful of? And Rich, you can, of course, answer this as well.
Well, I'm not going to talk about specifics because there are a number of things that are available. Unfortunately, too many times they come as options for a bin installation. You can buy a stairway that goes up the outside of a grain bin. Many times that isn't purchased. Instead, we just have a ladder that goes up the side, and that just isn't as easy to climb, and it's a lot easier to fall off of. So grain bin companies have the products in general available, and I think we just need to be willing to investigate and maybe spend a little money to make sure that not only are we, but our families and others are safe.
All right. Thanks so much, Ken. I do want to be mindful of everybody's time. We have 4 minutes left. I know we already had a couple people that needed to leave. There was a question in the chat about that Purdue report. So I just put that link in the chat so that you can check all of that out. Like I said, it's usually released in March. So March, we should be looking for the 2020 report. But if you're interested in the 2019 numbers, you can find them there. As we wrap up here, we do have a couple quick tools that we